Welcome back for the afternoon session of the Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop. We're going to start with our next speaker, so please come down and take a seat. Our next speaker really doesn't need an introduction in this audience. His name is Ron Simenhois. He's currently working for the Colorado Avalanche Information Center as a highway forecaster and also as a data scientist. Ron has had a very interesting career forecasting for ski areas, industrial applications, and now highways. And he's also contributed to the science aspect of our community in some very meaningful ways. Today, he's going to talk to us about some new insights into dry slab avalanche release. Please give a warm welcome to Ron Simenhois.
Good afternoon. This talk will cover our new understanding of dry slab avalanche release, how we verify those understandings, and some potential practical implication arising from those new insight. In the process, I will introduce a few newish terms that we currently use to describe the steps in dry avalanche release process. After all, it is clear that from all the people in this room, I should be the one to sort up your English vocabulary. This presentation is accumulation of a couple of recent publications and some unpublished stuff. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the folks that I collaborated on this project. And if you didn't notice, not all of them are part of the European Geek Squad. Those two are in the crowd. Avalanches start on a micro scale with small cracks between the snow grains. When a large enough external load is applied to the snowpack, it initiates a crack. If the crack propagates under the external load to a critical size, the stress on the crack tips due to the slab load itself exceeds the resistance of the weak layer for fracturing. The system becomes dynamic, and self-sustained crack propagation starts. We call this stage dynamic crack propagation. If the crack propagates over a large enough section of the steep enough slope, the slab breaks away from its surrounding snowpack. The crown and flanks and starch wall appears, and downslope of avalanche starts. There is little we know about dynamic crack propagation. This talk is about what we know and why it is important. Now, some people are going to use, instead of dynamic crack propagation, they're going to use slope scale propagation, because that's what actually dictates the size of the avalanche. So why do we care about dynamic crack propagation? Well, I care, and this is my 15 minutes of fame. So you have to put up with me for a wee while. Other than that, as far as we know, the size of an avalanche is dictated by the dynamic crack propagation, and we may be able to leverage some of the properties of dynamic crack propagation to improve our risk reduction. Until recently, we had two competing crack propagation theories, the shear propagation mode and the pure anti-crack mode. The problem is that, according to the shear mode, avalanches are almost impossible to trigger on slopes flatter than 35 degrees. And we all seen avalanches getting triggered on those slopes. And according to the collapse mode, when you think about the load distribution on steep slope, avalanches are almost impossible to trigger on slopes steeper than 45 degrees. And again, we've seen remote trigger and WUMF before. Until recently, we relied on Jean Goum's model that used both weak layer collapse and shear mode to describe the crack propagation. In 2014, Dave Hermes and others presented a data set of crack speed estimates from avalanche videos. The method they used was simple. They noted the time and location of where the avalanche was triggered, the time and place where the crack started to appear on the snow surface, and drove the speed drove the speed from the distance between the trigger point and the surface cracks and time it took for those cracks to appear. The challenge with this approach lies with its failure to account for the time delay between the moment of weak layer crack reaches the boundary of the release area and the subsequent appearance of cracks on the snow surface. Nevertheless, those measurements reveal unexpected results. About 30% of those estimates were about 100 meters per second and well above the previous measurements from WUMF PSTs and above the speed prediction of both anti-crack and super shear. And by the way, 100 meters per second is about 200 miles an hour, faster than any one of you drove today. So it appears that the process we see on flat terrain, PST, and full-scale avalanches are not always the same. Recently, computer modeling of avalanche release has become increasingly more accurate. Those models accurately predict measurement from PST tests. Another example is this realistic model-generated video of avalanche that Jean Goum created. How realistic this video is a good indication of the model's accuracy. The increase in model accuracy and the scale mismatch between column test and measurement on slope-side avalanche led Jean and his group to model large column tests to see how cracks in the weak layer propagate. This video simulates a PST on 30-meter long columns. The top column is on flat terrain, and the bottom column is on 30-degree slope. Everything else is similar. Clearly, the slope makes a big difference on how cracks along the weak layer propagate. We call this fast propagation super shear crack propagation. We call it super shear because the weak layer crack propagates in a shear mode, and it is very fast. It is not bound by the slab, because it does not bound by the slab elastic speed, wave speed. Let's look at where the crack propagation between the two columns diverge. It seems to be somewhere around 5 meters from where the crack initiation started. We call this point supercritical crack length. And as you can see, it's well past the typical column test size. Therefore, there is no wonder we did not see the transition between slow collapse mode and fast propagating super shear regime in our field test. This is a 2D illustration of slope-side avalanche. On the left is what it looks like along the weak layer. On the right is what the avalanche looks like on the snow surface. As you can see, when large enough crack is initiated in the weak layer, it propagates at the same speed in all directions. Once it reaches the supercritical crack length, it starts rapidly propagates up and down the slope in a super shear mode. The cross-slope crack propagation speed remains limited to the collapse wave speed. And this is a conceptual illustration of what the slab deformation looks like during the avalanche release in real avalanches. I draw the blue line across the slope to illustrate the slab deformation. So how do we know that the crack mode changes from mixed mode anti-crack to super shear after it reaches the supercritical crack length? The reality is that we don't know exactly what happened when the avalanche release. However, a model predicts specific behavior. If we can confirm those behaviors, we can be confident that our model described the avalanche formation reasonably well. In our case, fast super shear crack propagation up and down the slope, and slower cross-slope propagation. So, life is simple. We only need to develop a method to measure weak layer crack propagation speed of real avalanches in different directions. Here we present a new method to measure crack speed from avalanche videos that does not rely on visible crack on a snow surface. For example, this video of a small avalanche experiment from SLF. It would be nice to see. It'd be nice if you could see it in a more insightful way. Maybe something like this. As it turned out, sometimes we can. We just saw the same video after applying a method known as Eulerian video magnification to amplify suitable movement in the snow surface. For this study, we assume that those snow surface movements are indication of the fracturing weak layer underneath it, and therefore allow us to detect weak layer crack propagation on a slope scale from real avalanches. We built on the idea of Eulerian video magnification to develop a detection algorithm. We call it Eulerian video detection, or I use the term EVD. Essentially, what we do is tracking the pixel intensity or brightness of every location on the slope during the duration of the video. For example, let's follow the average pixel intensity in the green rectangle. On the upper right in blue is the pixel intensity. In red is the pixel intensity signal after we filter in the noise. The bottom chart is the derivative of the red signal. What we are looking for are steep changes in the line, in this case marked in red, in the red rectangle on the lower plot. The dark vertical line traversing the chart corresponds to the time of the video, in the video. Now, if we apply the process everywhere on the slope and mark each location as we detect strong changes in pixel intensity, we can track the surface movement as a proxy for crack propagation tips as they progress across the slope. To see if our assumption of that snow surface movement a good proxy for crack propagation, we use the EVD to detect both snow surface movement and weak layer fracture along the sidewall. And we are very excited to see that the snow surface movement and the weak layer crack tip track well together. Finally, we use the EVD on location outside the avalanche boundary, and we find no drastic pixel intensity changes within the avalanche, like in the avalanche zone. Now that we feel somewhat confident, we can start using the EVD on slightly more exciting avalanches. This deep slab avalanche was triggered in 2019 in Wallace, Switzerland. Luckily, the snowboarder is a phenomenal rider and managed to ride it out. Using the EVD reveals that the weak layer crack propagation quickly advances in a downslope direction and in slower speed across slope direction. Only much later in the process, we start seeing crack propagating on the snow surface. We also look at this video from Alaska. And the sequence is the same. Fast crack propagation down the slope and slower cross-slope propagation with surface cracks becoming visible much later in the process. We also look at this avalanche from Juneau, Alaska. And again, fast downslope crack propagation and slow cross-slope propagation. In total, we have 49 speed estimates from 6 videos. Now, if graphs are not your thing, feel free to doze out for a few minutes. And rest assured, we'll be back on the solid ground of moving snow shortly. For the rest of you, this plot shows those estimates with the time from initiation on the x-axis and this distance on the y-axis. The arrows represent the direction of propagation, and black for hard slab, gray for soft slab. It appears that our estimates start to diverge into 2 main groups after 25 meters, the slope direction group and the cross slope group. We use the average speed for each direction in each avalanche to calculate the speed up and down slope direction and cross slope direction. The dashed line represents the mean speed in slope and cross slope direction. The steeper the line, the higher the speed. The cross slope speeds are in line with speed measurement from PSTs and WUMFs. The up and down slope direction speeds are much faster and in line with the upper measurement of Henry's. This pattern confirmed the transition from collapse to supershear crack propagation mode that we talked about earlier in the talk presentation. So other than giving me an excuse to watch videos at work, What are the practical implications? Avalanche size are typically dictated by the terrain and spatial variability of the snowpack. However, can crack speed indicate the size of avalanches within these limitations? We did not find clear correlation between cross-slope crack speed and propagation distance. We suspect that, among other things, the terrain prevented long-distance crack propagation, regardless of propagation speed. That being said, we have strong indication that propagation speed on flat terrain correlates well with propagation distance. How about slope direction? An initial look-see at the data suggests that there is a positive correlation between crack speed and propagation distance. These are encouraging results, especially when we look at speed estimates from large slope, marked here in red, when there are less terrain limitation in the slope direction. So it appears that a better understanding of dynamic crack propagation can help us forecasting avalanche size. Putting together a few of the concepts we just discussed here, we can start thinking about different ways to go about avalanche reduction methods. For example, avalanche defense structures. Avalanche defense structure designed to anchor the snowpack to the slope and stop avalanches from running altogether. Therefore, they need to be robust and densely placed across the slope, or in other words, very expensive. Now, if we can protect infrastructure by preventing avalanches from reaching them rather than stopping them altogether, we may be able to design smaller, more affordable avalanche defense structure by splitting large avalanches into several small avalanches and therefore reducing the overall run-out distance. For example, Stanley. Stanley is an avalanche path that keeps me from sleeping several times a winter. It has several GASX units for avalanche mitigation marked in circle, here in circle. Depending on the portion of the start zone that avalanches, debris clearing time can be up to 6 hours long. So what if instead of anchoring the snowpack to the slope, we create a special variability in the slab thickness that arrests or delay weak-layer crack propagation across the start zone? Since crack propagation is slower across slope, this structure will completely stop section of the avalanche of the start zone from avalanching, or create a delay between smaller avalanches, preventing them from reaching to the road. This is an idea we're currently exploring. If it works, it can reduce the installation and maintenance cost of avalanche defense structures. We did numerical simulation with the proposed defense structure. In this video, those structures stop one side of the slope from avalanching and split a large avalanche into smaller avalanches with release delay large enough to prevent them from merging and producing a large avalanche flow on the other side of the slope. So far, it looks promising, but there are a few more things we need to figure out. Numerous studies propose distinct crack propagation regime on flat terrain, cross slope, and up and down slope direction. Nevertheless, prior to this point, we did not have field observation to substantiate this concept. These speed estimates provide the first field observation to support this idea. And on this optimistic note, I want to acknowledge the people that helped with this paper and presentation, and to thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Ron. Yeah. All right, we have time for a couple questions for Ron. If anybody could understand him through his thick accent.
Don't be shy to not ask questions.
All right, looks like we have a question in the back.
Hello. Hey, did your research suggest that crack propagation moves at the same speed up and down the slope, or is that different?
The theory is yes. It may depend on the tension strength of the slab. So up the slope, it might not going to go as fast, just because the slab breaks as the crack propagate up, and it never really reached that supercritical crack length. But if the slab is strong enough, it should go the same speed up and down.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
Oh, down here, Bex.
How did you go about selecting which videos to analyze?
well, not always videos work. I need to have good lighting. Ideally, it needs to be stable. I just tried quite a few videos and used the one that worked.
It's a good, honest answer. Maybe one more question if, looks like down here.
I can yell.
No, we'll wait for you, Raj. Just hang on.
Hi, Ron. Testing? Yeah. Did the up and down slope propagation speeds change with slope angle? And if so, was it proportional?
I don't remember if it's proportional, but it does change with slope angle, and also the supercritical crack length changes with slope angle.
Is that quantifiable?
We have one video that we suggest, but we don't really have the data on the snowpack on that video. And that's one data point. There's not much you can say compared to the other slopes.
But is it in the model?
Yes, it is in the model. Sorry.
All right. Well, thanks, Ron. That was great. Ron will be around this afternoon if you want to ask him some other questions. All right, our next speaker is Nata de Leeuw again. This time she's going to be talking to us about wind slabs and storm slabs, so welcome.
All right, hello everyone. I'm back. This time talking a little bit more about what exactly is a wind slab, and when is it maybe actually a storm slab? All right, so to give you a bit of background, we talked about this morning. I started my ski patrol career in southern Alberta, where it's very windy. Not super close to here. Here we are, down here in Breckenridge. And the place I used to ski patrol, Castle, is way up here it's in Alberta, but just on the BC and Montana border. So, I can see BC from the top of the mountain, and when the road's in, I can ride my snowmobile to Montana on one tank of gas. So we're not that close to each other between southern Alberta and here in Breckenridge, but what these two places have in common is that they're pretty windy. So from Castle, when you look to the west, you have mountains as far as you can see. When you look to the east, you're looking out towards the prairies. So similar sort of terrain to what's happening on the east slope of the Rockies in Colorado. And so sometimes I try to explain to people just how windy Castle is and the role that wind plays in my life. And this is a video of me and one of my good friends trying to leave the top hut. I think we were going to go do sweep at the end of the day. And that's just a day in the life of a Castle ski patroller, I guess. And so I talked about that this morning, how we listed a wind slab problem pretty much every single day, and how my thesis looked at the relationship between meteorological properties and wind slab physical properties. But that's not what I'm here to talk about now. What I'm here to talk about is, before you can study something, you have to define it. And this brings me to the wind slab and storm slab debate. And I don't know exactly how common this debate is in Colorado or the US, but people in Canada love to have this argument. And this project comes very much from a Canadian perspective, but hopefully it's applicable to some of you, and I would like to expand some of my research into the US if possible. So when I was at Castle, we would regularly have this argument in forecast meetings. And I'm sure some of you have had it too. We'd all been skiing around on the same snow that day. We'd done the same avalanche control. We'd seen the same avalanches. We'd shared our observations with each other. But at the end of the day, when we had to write a forecast, we'd get in these big arguments about whether we wanted to call it a wind slab or a storm slab. And eventually came to realize that we actually were talking about the same thing. It was just an issue of semantics. There we go. All right, so what I'm going to go into with this talk, I'm going to go over some definitions to help us give context to what we're seeing. I'm going to go through an InfoX investigation that I did, and then I'm going to talk about ideas and that different people have suggested to me to help maintain consistency. And my goal isn't to solve this problem and to come out of this being like, this is what a wind slab is, this is what a storm slab is, but I want to promote productive discussion on deciding how we can better classify these two terms. Okay, first, definitions. So we probably all realize that wind slabs and storm slabs exist on a bit of a continuum, and it's difficult to take something that exists on a continuum and classify it into binary categories, but that's exactly what we're trying to do. And when I started reading the literature, I realized there are actually two different ways that wind can transport snow. And these are redeposition and preferential deposition. All right, so first off, redeposition. We're all pretty familiar with this. This is when snow falls, it sits there on the ground for some time, it's entrained by the wind and blown somewhere new. And it lands probably on a lee slope. And I think most of us would agree that, yeah, we're going to call that a wind slab. This redeposition results in a wind slab. The other is preferential deposition. And so that's when snow falls preferentially into a lee area or other depositional zone. And the distinction here is whether or not the snow has already touched the ground. So in preferential deposition, it has not already touched the ground, and it has not undergone saltation. And what I started to think is, it seemed like preferential deposition is where a lot of the confusion was coming from, because when snow falls straight down and ends up evenly distributed on the terrain, most of us would probably agree that that's a storm slab. But what about when snow falls on an angle, or when snow falls sideways, like in this picture? And I think that's where a lot of the confusion in how people label these things comes from. All right, so if we back up to the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, and we look at the definitions for these two terms. Storm slab is defined as a cohesive slab of soft new snow that creates a short-term instability. Wind slab is defined as a cohesive slab of locally deep wind-deposited snow. And the formation process proposed is wind transport of falling snow or surface snow. And I want to highlight these terms, falling snow or surface snow. So according to the conceptual model, what this sounds like to me, falling snow, that's your preferential deposition, and surface snow that's been entrained, that's your redeposition. So according to the definition in the conceptual model of avalanche hazard, which is very widely used in Canada and most of the US as well, both of these terms should be classified as a wind slab. And this looks pretty cut and dry, but I think we all know it's not that simple. I know from my experience, sometimes I label something that is preferential deposition, sometimes I label that a storm slab. And I don't, like, sometimes I think maybe this has to do with where people are trained, what they're used to. I'm sure that me and my Castle ski patroller friends aren't the only ones who do that. I've talked to people from other areas, and I wanted to look more into this. You know, sometimes preferential deposition can act more like a storm slab. Sometimes it can act more like a wind slab, and what feels like a storm slab to one person might feel like a wind slab to another person. So my goal was to look into this and see, hey, how common are these inconsistencies in the Canadian avalanche industry? And what's great about doing research in the Canadian industry is that we have the InfoX. And the InfoX is a data sharing platform used by most of the industry. I don't know, who here has used the InfoX or uses it? I'm just curious. Okay, so it's being used to an extent around here. What's great about it is we submit to it every day. So every day we submit all of our avalanche observations, control work, snowpack summary. There's a built-in PWL tracker, and we do our forecasting workflow based on the conceptual model in the InfoX. And the power of the InfoX is the data sharing. So this information we're submitting all goes to Avalanche Canada to help them write public bulletins. We share it with our nearest neighbors, so if you haven't been on the snow in a while, you can check exactly what's going on at a neighboring operation. And because everything is so shared in Canada, they really emphasize consistency. And so I wanted to look at how consistent are we really. So what I did is I examined all the storm slab submissions that were submitted to the InfoX during a sample period. And the sample period I used was January of 2021. I wanted to do a whole season, but this ended up being really time-consuming, and using January eliminates the influence of spring problems, like aspect dependence because of the sun. And what I did is I recorded any storm slab that could be first preferential deposition, the result of preferential deposition, or a storm slab that included a wind slab. So what this looks like, preferential deposition storm slabs. So according to the definitions, a storm slab should exist in all the terrain, but if I saw a storm slab that only existed on certain aspects, I would go to the operation that submitted that storm slab that day and look at what their dominant wind direction was. And if this storm slab existed in the lee of the dominant wind direction, I would classify it as being caused by preferential deposition. And usually there were comments associated with the storm slab problem that supported this. So that was one thing I was looking at. And then I also started looking at storm slabs that included a wind slab. And what this was is I'd see a storm slab and it would exist on all aspects, but then it would be associated with comments like this, saying strong winds are forming the slab, or larger size on wind-loaded slopes. In the Alpine, this is a wind slab, or just straight up, this includes a wind slab problem. And then I grouped these by operation, because I wasn't necessarily interested in how often each individual one came up. I wanted to know how many operations are using these terms in different ways. And here's what I found. So in January of 2021, 133 operations submitted at least one storm slab problem to the InfoX. 20% of these operations submitted a preferential deposition storm slab. So that's 1 in 5 operations. And then 26% submitted one of those storm slabs that contained a wind slab. So about 1 in 4 operations. And remember, this was just 1 month of data. Those storm slabs that contained a wind slab, sometimes they also contained a dry loose problem, but I wasn't looking at this here. And that made me think maybe people are using the term storm slab. I saw this most commonly in morning meetings when uncertainty was high. And so it made me think maybe people are using the term storm slab similar to the European new snow problem. That was just an idea I had. And then to look into this a little bit more, what you're seeing here is these are all the forecast regions in Canada prior to this year when they went to flexible forecast regions. And the numbers are the number of operations in that region that submitted at least one preferential deposition storm slab. The 2 there represents all the mountain parks put together. And what you can see here is that this isn't just a specific regional problem. These preferential deposition storm slabs are being used, that term's being used throughout most of Canada where we have avalanches. The other thing that you can see from this, if you know a bit about the regional distribution of operations, is, you see that 5 and the 3 in the coastal areas. Those are relatively high numbers, and the coastal areas are known for being windy. And then you have that 2 that represents the mountain parks, and that 2 down there, down in southern Alberta. There's only 2 operations in that region. So that's also a proportionally high number. So you can see that in windy areas, operations are more likely to call something that was the result of preferential deposition a storm slab rather than a wind slab. So what conclusions did this bring me to? Well, there appear to be discrepancies in how the term storm slab is used on the InfoX. And this indicates inconsistency in how the terms storm slab and wind slab are applied in the Canadian avalanche industry. And what I was looking at here, because I was looking at internal professional data sharing rather than public bulletins, my hope was that it was taking out the issue of public communication and really was just looking at how do avalanche professionals interpret and apply these terms amongst themselves. So the last thing, ideas. A lot of these ideas aren't necessarily mine. They're ideas from other people I've talked to. So if the industry decides, hey, consistency is important to us, some things we could do, we could look at in-house definitions. So maybe the definition you're using at your operation isn't exactly the same as the rest of the industry, but at least as long as you at your operation know what each other are talking about, and there's that balance between consistency versus applying these terms as they work for you in your region. I've also talked to people about changing the avalanche problems. Some people have said, we need more, we can have sub-problems, and other people have said, no, we need less problems. So that can go either way. And then the flow chart, like is used in Colorado. I know the forecasters here have a flow chart that when they're having an argument during their forecast meetings, I've been told they can just pull out the flow chart and reference it. And then another idea that I thought is pretty good is to define these problems based more largely on mitigation strategy. So if you read the original conceptual model of avalanche paper, there is a column for each avalanche type that says this is the mitigation we use. And so relying more on that, because if in the end we end up with the correct mitigation strategy, it almost doesn't matter what we called it. In the future, I'd like to expand this research into the US, maybe using the National Avalanche Center database, and maybe look at case studies of individual operations and why they're using the terms the way they are. All right, I'd like to thank my committee members, people who I interviewed for this project, and the forecast team from Castle who inspired this whole thing. Thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Nata. Very interesting. Any questions out there? Anybody else had a struggle with the wind slab versus a storm slab? Nope, clear as mud.
Great.
We have a question in the back.
Up a discussion for us. Just wondering, for your mitigation strategy, does that semantics matter? Are you going out with different ordinance? Are you taking a different approach, mitigation strategy, when you classify something storm slab versus wind slab? We were just discussing that we're at Loveland. We pretty much call everything wind slab practically. Similar to Breckenridge, high alpine, right? A lot of lead deposition. So yeah, different strategy depending on what you call it.
Yeah, I think I heard most of that. So I know from my personal experience, a lot of the time, if we're going out ski cutting, we've called it a storm slab, and if we're going out with explosives, we've called it a wind slab, even though that storm slab might be a little bit aspect dependent. And so I think that's where a natural line just occurred, and that's how we use mitigation to strategy to classify things. But again, that's not totally consistent with how everyone else is using those terms. Everyone else would probably just call all of that a wind slab. So that's where it feels a little bit important, because it dictates the mitigation strategy. I don't know if that fully answered what you're asking.
Any other questions?
Someone's
Oh, in the back here.
I like the differentiation you made with storm slabs being spatially dependent. I'm just wondering, in quantifying those, have you looked into use snow density or wind speeds or anything as something to differentiate those wind slabs versus storm slabs?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're doing it that way based on physical properties, we're kind of back to what we used to do, which is just having hard slab and soft slab. Whereas storm slab and wind slab are terms that look more at how is this formed. So generally, people equate storm slabs with soft slabs and wind slabs with hard slabs, but they are slightly different definitions. And so I think that hardness or density isn't exactly built into the definitions of storm slab and wind slab. But we sort of use them that way. But yeah, I don't really have a solution for that. That wasn't what I was trying to come up with.
More asking questions
Yeah,
than
really.
offering solutions.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, well, she'll be around the rest of the afternoon, so please come up and ask more questions. Thanks, Nata. Well, I'm the next speaker, but in a lot of ways, I really just drew the short straw for presenting a work that a lot of folks, both in this room and across the U.S., have contributed to. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about a project that we did to try to understand the March 2019 avalanche cycle in Colorado using tree rings. I'd like to acknowledge the people that worked on this project, primarily or most notably Eric Peich, who's up there in your upper left, who's a scientist at the USGS. But the other thing I'd like you to notice from this is just how many people contributed to this. There's a whole bunch of people that are listed as co-authors on this paper, and then a whole nother group of people that spent a bunch of time and contributed to collecting the data that we used for this. And none of this work really could have been done without this large group of people and everybody that contributed. So some of you might remember that in March of 2019, during the first couple of weeks, we saw a large cycle of large avalanches over a very big area in Colorado. This really affected, I think, probably all of our lives. It had a big impact on my life during that time period for sure. These avalanches impacted and damaged utilities. They impacted and damaged occupied structures, and they closed roads in some cases for weeks. Here's a look at the size of the avalanches and the area that they're released in day by day during this avalanche cycle. And what really grabbed us looking back at this was both the number of large avalanches, but we had seen avalanche cycles with some big avalanches before, but then also the widespread area that these avalanches impacted. A really big part of Colorado, essentially stretching from Durango up towards Winter Park. Just looking at the numbers, during this 2-week period at the Avalanche Center, we recorded over 1,000 avalanches, and 87 of these were D4 or larger. Just for comparison, during the 9 years prior to this year, we recorded 24 avalanches in that size range. And there were at least 3 avalanches that we felt like we could call D5s without too much argument. So we had front row seats to this as it was unfolding around the highways and some of the towns. But a lot of the activity that we ended up seeing was deep in the backcountry. And so it took into the spring and in some cases deeper into the summer until we really started to understand the extent of this particular event. But one of the things that we saw just over and over again was the amount of vegetation damage that these avalanches produced. They ran wider than the traditional boundaries of their avalanche paths, and they ran further than the traditional boundaries of these paths. Here's one example that's sort of close to home. This is the Sky Chutes, which is in the 10-mile range. You can see the Breckenridge ski area over the ridgeline above the label of Sky Chutes, and the bottom of the image is the base area of the Copper Mountain ski area. And if we look at the Google Earth imagery before and after, you can see the extent of the vegetation damage that this cycle produced. This all happened within a few hours in this particular case, or maybe a couple of days with some of the stuff around the corner. And this is what we saw just over and over again, that there was really significant vegetation damage. And then it wasn't just 1 or 2 paths in an area. A lot of times it was many paths or even most of the avalanche paths in a particular area. So this cycle really felt like a historic event to us. But there's a pretty long history of avalanche activity in Colorado. And so it was hard to really kind of put it into context. We looked through our records, we talked to colleagues that were retired but still around, and we couldn't really find anything that compared that well to this particular cycle. But we still didn't really know exactly what it looked like. We did have some anecdotal evidence to help us kind of put us in context. This is a kiln that was built in the late 1800s near Lake City that was destroyed in the 2019 cycle. We also knew about a really big cycle that had happened in 1899, mostly in the Central Mountains, from historic photos and from newspaper reports. But we saw all of the vegetation damage, and we thought this is really an opportunity for us to try to understand this particular cycle better. At the center, we had a little bit of experience using trees to date avalanche events, But for the most part, what we had done in the past was go out and either core a tree or take a cross-section from a dead tree, count the rings, and that was really about it. And from looking at what we had to try to tackle, we felt like we needed to do a little bit more complicated work than that, more intricate work. Fortunately, we had some friends in Montana working at the USGS that were just completing a study of looking at avalanche climatology through tree rings in and around Glacier National Park and in southeast Alaska. And so we called them up, said we needed some help. And fortunately for us, they saw the opportunity very similar to what we were looking at and offered to collaborate with us. The first thing that we did is try to figure out how we wanted to collect data. For the most part, what we had done in the past was go into each avalanche path, take a section from a tree, count the rings, and kind of call it good. And what they talked to us about was really focusing our efforts in particular avalanche paths. So this is a map of Independence Pass. Most of these avalanche paths ran during this particular cycle, and so rather than taking one sample from each path, what we did was focus on a few paths in this area, and in each one of those paths collect much more data. So we collected upwards of 50 samples in each one of these avalanche paths and a whole bunch of information about each one of these samples. Once we had our data collection scheme up and running, we headed out into the debris piles with chainsaws and tape measures and spent a couple years, our summer vacations, collecting data. Each of the tree samples that we collected, we eventually sent up to Montana for the folks at the USGS, this is Danny here, to do lab work to try to collect the data from the actual sample. They're using a technique to look for growth disturbances in the annual growth rings and use that to date and understand these events. In the lab, they would look for these growth disturbances, and the two major ones that they were looking for were reaction wood, which is tilting. So you have a tree that gets hit by an avalanche, doesn't get destroyed, but it gets bent over, and then it spends the next couple of years trying to straighten itself out, and you can see that signature in the wood. They also looked for scarring or wounds. So again, the tree gets hit by an avalanche, it sustains some damage but doesn't get destroyed, and then over the next few years, that wound heals, but that mark is still in the tree. And then with the data that we collected and then other data sets out there, they could take these different events and actually put the event on the calendar. So we know that the event happened, but also the year that it happened. With the amount of data that we collected, they were able to do a more intricate analysis to look at the signal-to-noise ratio, kind of rank the quality of each individual sample, each individual growth disturbance in a particular sample, and come out with a much more robust data set where we could really be a lot more confident that these were avalanche events. So all in all, we spent 4 summers collecting data. We collected over 1,200 tree samples, and in those samples, there were over 4,000 growth disturbances. Now, because we have decent records of avalanche activity in Colorado, we took the reconstruction of the avalanche events that we had and compared it to our observational record. We knew about this one big avalanche cycle in 1899, and that showed up in our data record, but then we also looked at more recent data from 1980 on and compared the reconstructed to the observed avalanches and felt like that record compared fairly well. That gave us some confidence in the work that we were doing. So here's the entire record that we were able to construct. We were able to see avalanche events in Colorado going back into the late 1600s and continuing up to this 2019 avalanche cycle. In that data record, these 2 years, 1899, which we knew was a really big avalanche cycle, and 2019, which we had witnessed, were the 2 largest events that we could document. Also, fortunately for us during this time, there was a group in Europe that was building a new statistical model to look at regional avalanche cycles through tree rings. And we were able to apply their model to our data set. What we're looking at here is the annual probability, so the probability of every one of the avalanche cycles that we were able to document, and whether it was part of a widespread, so over a large area, cycle of large avalanche events. The dots on the screen are the mean probability, and the shaded areas are the 95% confidence interval. And what we saw was that, of course, as you go back in time, the confidence in these different events is pretty broad. But as we get closer to modern era, where we have more signal in the trees, we have more confidence in what we're seeing. And these two events in 1899 and 2019 both had a high probability of being part of one of these avalanche cycles and a fairly narrow confidence range. The other thing that we saw is that overall the model shows that the probability of an event like this happening in Colorado is decreasing, especially over the last 100 years. So just some high points from the work that we did. We put together kind of a diverse group of people and had a big collaboration of both scientists and avalanche practitioners to try to put this work together. We were able to put together a very large data set that we can use to study avalanche climatology. We're looking at a couple of the results today, but we hope to get a lot more out of this data set in the years to come. We were able to document avalanche cycles from the late 1600s through 2019. And from what we looked at, that reconstructed record, correlated quite well with observations. And then we were also able to look at this probability that these cycles were part of large events during this period. So the take home from what I'm presenting today is that this work suggests that the probability of an avalanche cycle like this happening in Colorado over the last 100 years has slowly been decreasing. But the two largest events that we see in the record also happened during that 100-year period. And so that gives us some things to think about as we look towards the future. I'd like to acknowledge the folks that funded this research. Again, it was a pretty big collaborative effort. And I'll answer a few questions if anybody has any. Thanks for your attention. I don't have anybody to help me field questions, so. Okay. We'll take this question here, and then you can get to the mic.
You said one of the major takeaways was that the likelihood of historical cycles, like the two of those, is decreasing. Why is that, other than the statistical evidence?
Well, the statistical evidence is something that we can interpret, but causation is something that we can't really pinpoint from this particular study. But there is certainly a lot of work being done in the climate change community that might be able to offer some answers eventually.
What was the biggest tree you found from 2019?
I actually might have to ask Jason for help. Something around this big. One of the things that that we have learned both in this study and in other studies that we've done is that the size of the tree in Colorado does not correlate that well to the age of the tree. Any other questions?
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Does this study kind of like change the way that you design avalanche mitigation like for highways or other, types of infrastructure?
That's a really good question. I don't know if this study by itself does that, but certainly this study adds to some of the complexities that we see in the observational record when we're trying to look at infrastructure planning and land use planning around resiliency. So in terms of what sort of natural hazards we expect to see in the future. It doesn't make it any clearer.
Were you able to find usable data from tree cores versus cross sections?
We were. In this study, we really focused on cross sections because we had so many available. Some of the work that Eric did around this study was comparing like what kind of information and the confidence in the information you could get from cross sections versus cores. And there's a little bit of disagreement in that world, which I'm not part of as a snow person. But you get better information from a cross section, and so that was what we focused on. Some people would argue how much better the information is. The Europeans are really using a lot more coring, but we focused on cross sections. We have a repeat offender over. Oh.
Another tree question. As you looked at trees, as they get bigger, they're probably less susceptible to, being knocked over by an avalanche, or at least I tell myself that when I'm out in the backcountry. Is there a correlation then, like around when you were doing this with those folks, as a tree gets older, does it not show as much of that scarring where, like, if a younger tree is in the path, like, it showed like, well, I really got pushed over, whereas like the big one was like, didn't really bother me. Like, is that noticeable in the rings,
I don't have a good answer for that. I think in a lot of cases, the younger trees are actually getting destroyed in the size of events that we're looking at. And so the larger trees have kind of a more rich data history. But in the probability chart that I showed, you can see the confidence intervals widening dramatically as we went back in time. And that's because there is a weaker signal as you go back in time, and part of that is because there are fewer trees that have survived that whole period. In some ways, avalanches, if they're destroying the signal in some of these areas, and so that's why we get essentially just less confidence as we move into more historic events.
Did you find that trees were being broken off at the snow surface during the avalanche event, or were they being uprooted from the ground? Imagine a mid-path versus like deposition zone could be different.
Yeah, we saw both. I was talking to Art Mears, who's been looking at big avalanches in Colorado as long as anybody who's still around. And one of the comments that he made was the number of trees that were ripped out with the root balls intact in this event. And we saw a lot of that, and we targeted some of those because they offer a little bit, again, more kind of richer history. So we saw a lot of trees that were just ripped out of the ground in this particular event. But it changed in a lot of different places. There's one path in the Lake City area. This is just one example. There's a lot of paths like this, but a big one where especially the airborne, at least probably the airborne part of the avalanche went over the ridgeline. And so there's an area there with about 3 acres of trees that are all cut off at 40 feet above the ground. So there's a lot of different things that you could kind of find depending on where you looked. Okay, I think unless anybody has another burning question, I'll be around, of course, the rest of the afternoon. So happy to try to answer more questions. We're now at the afternoon break, and so we're a little bit ahead of schedule. So yeah, we'll reconvene at 2:45. Thanks for your attention, and please visit the vendors and talk to the speakers about all the ask.